These were lethal. They're still
Yeah.
lethal. You can actually.
Okay, we're at Hal Kennedy, N4 GG, N4 Golf Golf, looking at, I believe he calls it Blue Lightning, but I refer to it as Old Sparky. So tell us what all this is about, Hal, if you don't care.
Yeah, well,
The components.
right. It starts with 120 volts AC, which comes into this power transformer. And the key is right in series with the primary. So there's 120 volts on the key. The transformer steps it up to 12,000 volts. The 12,000 volts comes through a safety gap, which should never fire, but if the main gap doesn't fire, the safety gap will fire, which protects the transformer from getting burned out. Then the high voltage goes through RF chokes. Out of the RF chokes, the high voltage literally goes right across this gap. So when the rotary gap comes along, it fires a spark. This is a set of 6 capacitors, and for the hams they're about 001 microfarads each, so that's about 006. Everything's in parallel. And that's in series with the coil that's the primary of the output transformer. So the high voltage also goes through the capacitor, through the output transformer, and then back to the spark gap. Every time it fires, the capacitor is discharged through the coil, which puts an impulse into the antenna on the other side of the output transformer. The voltage that rings up and down on the capacitors is about 75 kV. So it's dangerous.
Yes.
When the gap fires, the discharge of the capacitors is around 1,000 amps. So when the gap's firing, you got 1,000 amps going through the gap. And when the gap's not firing, you got 75,000 volts across the capacitor. So it's a pretty dangerous machine, and you do have to pay some respect to it and keep your wits about you. There are 2 parts that are not very authentic. One is the motor. It's a 1950s tall-type motor. It's very hard to, it's synchronous. It's very hard to get a synchronous motor from 1910, 1915. They're around, but you really got to search for those. The other is the transformer. You can find spark era transformers, but those are rare too. This one's a neon sign transformer. Does exactly the same job the same way, but these are plentiful and you can get your hands on one. The rest is pretty authentic. These are slate-based switches. This is a spark key from 1915. This is a Signal Electric. You can see how thick the contacts are.
Mm-hmm.
You also notice a nut. You can take the contacts out and replace them, because if you send enough in spark, you'll wear the contacts out. This I was able to date. This came out of the IRT subway system in New York around 1910. It's got serial numbers on it. The conductors use these to turn the lights off and on in the subway stations. Everything else is handmade. This is all mahogany. It's finished like you would in 1910. The output transformer is a copy of the one up in W1AW, old Betsy, and it puts out about 5 amps of RF into the antenna. So that's the quickie explanation. In the capacitors is copper sulfate solution. It's a conductor, and it's in contact with copper rods. You got to keep the chemistry correct. If it wasn't copper sulfate, it would eat up the copper rods eventually. So that's set up that way. That's it.
Okay, all right. And put some fire in the wire.
Sure. Yeah. Let's do it. Are you ready?
We're ready.
That's a sync motor. So it's spinning at 1800 RPM, which is what, 30 revs a second. There's 8 contacts, so 8 times 30 is 240. So there's 240 sparks a second, and that affects how it sounds on the receiver side. This closes the circuit between the key and high voltage. Are you ready, Ruth?
Let me, I want to send,
Yeah.
come here, Ruth, hold it.